Being two Western countries that have tightly connected and interwoven histories, Germany and the US share a lot of commonalities between our two cultures. But there are still some very important social customs you do not want to mess up in Germany, or else it could mean death. Well, maybe not death. It just wouldn't be friendly to do these things.
Hey guys, and welcome back to our channel. I am Donnie.
And I'm Aubrey.
And we are two Americans currently living in Germany and sharing all of our experiences living and traveling throughout Europe. Often there are a lot of overlaps between German and American culture, and a lot of this has to do with the huge impact German immigrants had on the US. German is the #1 family heritage in the US, with some 46 million Americans that can claim German heritage. Looking at a map of the US, you can see how many states have German heritage as the #1 claimed heritage of the state's population. Therefore, Germany has had a strong part in shaping the US's customs, culture, and social norms. But even with these similarities, we still have noticed a huge difference in how formal or informal Germans and Americans act or treat other people in our daily lives. This can be from how we socialize with our colleagues at work to how we interact with people that we don't know. Jumping into one of these cultures for the first time can raise questions like, what do Americans call people to show respect? To why do Germans seem so uptight? We'll cover all of this and more today in our video, Informal, Formal. Are Americans or Germans more laid back?
As we like to point out in all of our videos, we are Americans, specifically from a small state in the South called Oklahoma, and we now live in Rhineland Falls, a German state in Southwest Germany. Therefore, our observations may be a little more specific to these parts of our two countries. We know there are differences in individual personalities and sometimes even very different customs and cultures within a single country, but we have traveled all over both countries and have observed a lot of these things in different regions, giving us a pretty good idea of what the two cultures generally are like. So you may have a slightly different take or perspective on this subject, so be sure to leave all those thoughts in the comments so we can all learn from each other.
One of the first differences you'll learn when you are learning either English or German is the difference in how we talk to people, specifically when referring to someone else in the singular form. To start simply, in the US, when you are talking to someone else, you very simply refer to them as you. No matter if they are your friend, a stranger, old, young, etc. But this is not the case in Germany. In German, you have two different translations for the singular you, du and sie. Du is reserved for someone you are more familiar with, or how we would say in the US, on a first name basis with. So du is the informal way of saying you to someone you are close with. On the other hand, sie is the formal version of you. Sie is used for showing respect and, in a way, setting boundaries on your relationship with another person. Sie would be used when you are meeting someone, for a boss maybe, someone older than you, or again, someone you are not on a first name basis with.
A DW article titled, "In Germany, the Importance of Being Formal," they help explain the rules of formally addressing someone by stating, at a social event, for example, it would be considered impertinent for a 30-year-old to address somebody 20 years senior using du. And at work, rank trumps age and gender. If two people share a rank, they should be expected to address one another formally until the one who had served the company longest suggested otherwise. To be completely honest, this is something we struggle with when speaking German. Coming from a language that has no concept of this difference and a culture that, as we will explain, spoiler alert, we feel like is more laid back when it comes to social interactions, we don't understand all the nuances when it comes to which to use in which specific situations.
I have had a couple of conversations where we are using sie, and the person I am speaking with asked me if it is okay for them to use du with me rather quickly. And I've started to figure out how one literally asks to switch, but it is the when to use either or ask to switch that is foreign to me. I also understand for the most part that with older people, for example, it is for them to initiate, but What about if I'm out and about and meet someone my age? Do I need to do the whole game of Sie then du, or can we just be casual and use du right from the get-go? Let us know in the comments your knowledge in this social norm in Germany and help us navigate it as we continue to learn.
What also makes this complicated is that in the US, we are much less formal with how we interact and refer to each other in most of our relationships. For example, we keep referring to the English phrase first name basis, but what does that mean in America? For the most part, Americans are very informal when meeting each other. Almost always when you meet someone, you will just introduce yourself by your first name, or you can say both your first and last names, but the other will just go right ahead and use your first name without asking if that's okay, and that's completely fine in most social interactions. This, of course, is what we are referring to by first name basis. It simply means you can use and call each other by your first names.
But are there situations you wouldn't be on first name basis with someone? The short answer is yes, but honestly, not that often, especially as you become an adult. And if I had to put a number on it, around your 20s, many people are able to start calling everybody by their first names. It is very common when you are dating someone, for example, in your teenage years or in your 20s, that you would call your significant other's parents Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so. But then if you get married or become more serious, they will then tell you to call them by their first names. But what about work and your colleagues or bosses? Aubrey and I both had bosses in the US older than us, but from day one, we used first names. This is extremely common for even in workplaces to immediately call everybody by their first names regardless of age or position.
In Germany, with the du, sie breakdown, we do feel like we hear Herr or Frau followed by last names being used a lot more often. This is the equivalent to Mr. and Mrs. in English. Traditionally, Miss is used for an unmarried woman, kind of like the old term Fraulein, but Ms. tends to be more of the modern professional term we see more today. In general, when a German person is using the formal forms of conversation and Sie, they will also call the other person Herr or Frau, then followed by the last name. We've heard that some workplaces are less formal these days and will be first name basis from the get-go, but not all of them. We have also heard that some German workplaces regularly use the informal form of talking when no customers are around and refer to each other by their first names, but when customers are around, they will refer to each other by Herr so-and-so or Frau so-and-so. I've even noticed some name tags of workers in retail stores say Frau or Herr so-and-so. Using Mr., Mrs., or Ms. in the workplace in the US feels kind of outdated and from the 50s. A great example of this is the show Mad Men, which is set in the 1950s for most of the show, and you hear secretaries being referred to as Ms. and bosses being referred to as Mrs. or Mr.
Nice to see you, Miss Blankenship.
I look forward to hearing that every day. There's coffee and a roll on your desk, and Mr. Sterling would like to see you.
I have also had the experience in my German class where our teacher told us that we would use du in first names in our class, but eventually we had a man join that has a PhD, and he was the only one she asked if that was okay for us to speak to him informally, or if we should still call him by his title and use the formal you, Sie. This can sometimes also be the case in the US if someone has a special title like doctor, in which one would call them by their title and last name, but again, it is not uncommon for even them to tell you just to call them by their first name, or even sometimes they will just say, just call me Dr. Donnie, or whatever their first name is.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dave Bradley, but you can call me Dr. Dave.
To come completely clean, this is a very complex subject that really requires a lot of knowledge in the nuances of social cues and social norms in both cultures that are very difficult to understand or pick up on unless you have lived in it for a long time. Granted, there are rules, but there are sometimes as many exceptions to the rules as there are rules.
So, without the different formal and informal yous, and if we almost always use first names, How then do people show others respect when we are addressing them in the US? One way is by using the terms sir or ma'am or miss for younger women. In general, if you want to be extra polite and show respect to someone, you use these words at the end of an answer or question to the other person. For example, an order from a boss could be replied to with yes sir, or a waiter might ask customers, what can I get for you, ma'am? Modern day German doesn't really have a translation for these words anymore, and the translations for these are considered archaic. I will acknowledge that even in the US, the use of sir or ma'am is also becoming more and more old-fashioned sounding, and primarily you hear these in the southern US nowadays, but it still is used today. When using sir or ma'am, there is a similarity with du or sie in that the older person has the right to tell you to stop using it if they want to become more informal. It is very common to be told, you don't need to call me ma'am, you're making me feel old, or something along those lines, and then these formalities are dropped.
And that is generally how I approach speaking to my bosses at work before they usually tell me I can stop referring to them as sir or ma'am. There is also a difference in the way that we converse with people in both countries. One of the most famous ways that we have addressed in previous videos is how Americans generally love small talk with strangers. Much more often than Germans do, at least. If an American is in a room alone with somebody they don't know, the odds are they will start to talk to them. We have to say this somewhat lightly because, again, everybody is different, and there are, of course, introverted people in the US who would choose not to small talk if they could avoid it, but a lot of times this small talk is warm, very friendly, and filled with lots of smiles. Americans are really big on joking around as well, and they also love to be lighthearted and love to laugh in these interactions. It wouldn't be unusual for someone you don't know to ask about your family, your job, what your plans are for the day or for the weekend, and especially in the South, you might even end up getting invited to coffee or dinner sometime. But what has our experience been with Germans?
We feel like a description of Germans when you meet them is perfectly written in an article from GermanCulture.com. They say, quote, in order to describe German customs and social interactions, intercultural consultants like comparing Germans to coconuts. Both have a hard exterior shell, which may take some time to crack, but are soft and sweet on the inside. Practically speaking, this means that German customs generally impose a certain formality when interacting with strangers and casual acquaintances. Most first meetings in Germany are characterized by a great degree of reserve. Germans will treat you politely, but not warmly, and they may not appreciate levity, joking around, or ironic wit. This is probably where the preconception of the dull German devoid of humor comes from. Just give them a little time. If you are gradually getting to know them better, they will eventually relax and prove that Germans do know how to have fun. We have even heard Germans described before, and we think we can confirm in some aspects. The Germans can sometimes be more difficult to become friends with, but once you do, you will have a very loyal friend for life.
One thing we have also learned living here, as well as traveling around and seeing other cultures, is the importance to not look at another culture through the lens of your own culture. We often hear that Americans think Germans are cold, rude, or harsh, and Germans think Americans are fake, surface level, or creepy. In fact, I found in a forum asking, is it offensive to approach Germans by their first name? A response stating, going in with first names and du while speaking German will tend to brand you as a stereotypical, overly familiar to the point of rudeness, condescending Ami. The fact is, when a German person comes from a culture where small talk isn't normal, and the only people who try to do it want something out of you or are being fake, that is the way they will perceive it even when an American does it, and when in actuality, it is just part of our culture and we genuinely are happy to be able to interact and talk with someone and have no other intentions. The same goes for in the US when we are used to people talking and being indirect and making lighthearted conversation, and anytime someone is actually direct or not smiling when they are talking, they are actually being rude. And so we perceive the same thing from Germans by looking at it through our lens. It is important to step back and realize these are just different cultures, sometimes not right or wrong, but just simply different.
To sum it up, in both countries, it is important to learn what formal and informal interactions are, and that it is better to err on the side of formal before being invited to go informal. This means using Sie and Herr or Frau, then last names in Germany, and Mr. and Mrs. in the US. However, most likely things will turn more informal much more quickly in the US than in Germany, and that is not to be confused with being rude or too close. There are still boundaries, but we just like to feel closer faster in most cases. There also are tons more social norms that we have not covered, like body language, what topics can be discussed with who, and what topics are off limits, dinner etiquette. Tons of people like to comment on differences between American and German dinner etiquette, so let us know if you want to see that in a video. This is just a brief introduction of our experiences with the formalities of each culture's social norms and not an in-depth overview of everything.
We hope that you enjoyed this video, you guys, and if you did, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and definitely hit that bell icon to be notified every time we upload a new video. And finally, don't forget to check out the links in our description because we have partnered up with various amazing businesses to give you some sweet deals on awesome products that we use literally every day. We will see you in our next video.
Cheers!
Is the #1 familial.
What the? Get out of here.
On the other hand, someone for a, no. What do Americans call each other? No. Now on a first name basis with, no, not on a, dang it.
And that's completely fine in most of the formal firms. Why can't I talk?
And they will say, just call me doctor, and then the first name. No. And then they will say, just call me doctor and then the first name. First name, or even sometimes they will say, just call me Dr. Donnie. Very complex subject that really...
Should I say, Donnie even has elevator jokes planned before we get into the elevators.
Do I?
Yeah, we've talked about this.
Like this has ups and downs?